Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Please do give us a shout in the chat box if you can't hear me or any of us. The internet connection is a little bit unstable over here. So yeah, just let us know in the chat if there's anything. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to talk about building some health and well-being hubs. We'll be discussing this at length today in quite an informal discussion. So a lot less about presentations, but a lot about discussions and everything with our speakers. For those who don't know me, I am Berenice Lamblin. I work at the Bromley by Bow Centre. I'm the Knowledge Share and Exchange Program Manager, so I organize similar webinars and physical, like in-person visits at the centre as well when COVID allows. So yeah, we're really happy to have you here today. Just to let you know as well, you should have had a notification as well when you joined, but this webinar is being recorded so that we can share with people who couldn't attend afterwards. So if you don't wish to appear in the recording, please do stay off camera and please say hi and say who you are in the chat box, and yeah, we can feel free to ask any questions during the webinar in the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye out, and we'll be kind of taking the questions and sometimes asking people to join in the discussion and unmute themselves. But yeah, I'll now hand over to Dan. So Dan Hopewell is my colleague at Bromley by Bow. He's the Director of Knowledge and Innovation, and he'll be kind of hosting this session today. And Dan, I'll hand over to you now.
Great, thank you very much, Berenice. And it's wonderful to have our incredible panel with us here today and to have everybody else on this.
And I'm not sure.
Yes, can you hear me now? Berenice, can you hear me now? Yeah, it's wonderful to have everybody here today, and it's great to have this fantastic panel that we have with us, and to have all of you coming from a very, very wide range of backgrounds as attendees and participants on today's webinar and discussion. This is a theme that is very, very close to the heart of and concerns of the Bromley by Bow Centre, and also Sarah and Will and Gordon, who are here with us today, and has really been of discussion for such a long time, really. If one thinks about the Bromley by Bow Healthy Living Centre that Gordon designed about 25 years ago now, thereabouts, it's been a continual refrain. Why aren't there more Bromley by Bow centres in the country? Its model is, in many senses, very self-evident in terms of the logic of bringing community and community provision together with primary care particularly, and how they might work together, and how the design of buildings with communities and with developing them with practitioners can help to create this integrated model of health and well-being that moves beyond the medical model towards a model that is about creating health with communities. And yet the examples of successor projects to the Bromley by Bow Centre are not tremendously numerous, although many people have taken away elements of Bromley by Bow and incorporated them into their models. The building of new centres that are modelled on ideas from Bromley by Bow, and indeed others as well, ideas of others, shows a sort of fairly checkered history, really, in terms of the success of those. So there are obviously considerable challenges that we face in terms of developing and moving beyond the kind of traditional, conventional understanding of facilities that create health or treat health and treat illness into a new paradigm. But there are also considerable opportunities. And I think one would argue actually imperatives in terms of modeling the new provision. we know, and you know, one only has to look at the demographic trends in our communities, the challenge that is faced if we only go on treating illness within these centres, and if we don't move into a new model of care around bringing together the services that do treat illness together with those that create health and well-being, and how we do that in a way that facilitates and encourages and promotes community agency. And so I think today's webinar is very, very important as we consider that. And also there is a considerable amount of NHS estate that is due for renovation. There are still dozens, hundreds of GP practices working out of inadequate premises that are unsuited even just for modern medicine, let alone for this approach to wider health and well-being. So the renovation of estate provides a significant opportunity to think differently about the model that we want to develop, and the kind of relationship and the co-relationship between both physical design and the process by which that design is brought about, and then what will inhabit those buildings in terms of the provision and services that will take place there, and what that model will look like. So it's a very, very important topic, and one that I think is actually central to the future of health and well-being, and indeed the future of the NHS as we go forward. So it's a really, really exciting topic to be discussing with you today. And as Berenice said, if you have questions, put them in the chat and we will invite those questions at certain points through today's discussion. It's going to be almost like a virtual coffee table discussion is what we're going to be having today. So I'd like to now invite our three panelists to introduce themselves initially, and then we will go into a discussion. But it'd be great just to hear a little bit about yourselves and your practice so that we have an idea of where you're coming from. So I'd like to just start off by inviting Will Nicholson, who is a long-term activist in this space, been working with communities down in South London for a long time with the health systems there as well, very much in this space of community co-produced health and well-being initiatives of a wide range. Will, it'd be great to just hear from you and get an idea of what you've been doing briefly before we go into the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks Dan, and hi everyone. As Dan started to introduce me there, my name is Will Nicholson. I'm, I guess, an independent health and wellbeing consultant, and I'm really passionate about about place and about connection, and about how we can bring, a bit like Bromley by Bow has, bring together that intersection between health and community and other kind of people and stakeholders that are based in a place, whether it's businesses, arts, sports, housing, and how all of this kind of interrelates with each other. And I kind of made it my passion over the last, particularly the last 10 years, to embed myself in the place where I live and work in Southwark and Lambeth, to get to know as many different people as possible from very much different backgrounds who shared the same interest in health and well-being, and had that connection around place, whether you live there or work there, or just had an interest in visiting a local area. And I'm really interested in finding ways to join people and to help people to connect. And I think Bromley by Bow, when I went to visit Bromley by Bow about 6-7 years ago now, I totally connected with the space, not for what it was physically, but what I felt was that ethos of place, of a community, and that all these different components of different people that are based in an area seem to somehow knit together. And I was really curious as to what it was that helped bring those people together in a physical space, and how you could then replicate that, because not everywhere has the same physical attributes as, you know, the land or the certain buildings, and everything looks different in different parts of town. So I was just really interested in almost what I've kind of described with Dan as the virtual Bromley by Bow. What is it about the ethos and the aspiration of working together and connecting and being part of a community. What is it you can learn from Bromley by Bow from that perspective, and then apply it in a different local setting in Southwark and Lambeth? And then I think relevant to this conversation today, through all the different projects that I've been involved in and partnerships in Southwark and Lambeth, I've been involved in many different types of health and wellbeing hubs initiative. You know, from the West Norwood Health and Leisure Centre to the Ackerman Health Centre, you know, and also it's the Tessa Jowl Health Centre. So really different starting points for each of those, really different locations, really different motivations for each of those. And I've also been involved in lots of different health and wellbeing hubs that sprung out from the community as well. So I think hopefully I can just bring a sense of a different flavour of the different considerations that different stakeholders have in thinking about a health and wellbeing hub. But for me, it's almost stepping back away from the physical space and thinking about that kind of ethos and culture and values that sit behind it, that hopefully I can bring to the table today. Thanks, Dan.
Great, thank you very much, Will. That's really excellent. A very, very important way of framing today's discussion as well. Sarah, I'd like to invite you to introduce yourself as well and your practice and yeah, great.
Thank you, Dan. I've got a few slides to show because I find it a bit easier to speak to pictures. So I'm just going to share my screen with everybody and hope that you can see that. Can you see that?
Yes, perfect.
Jolly good. Okay, well, look, thanks very much for the invitation to speak today. I don't really consider myself an expert, but I'm an architect and with my own practice. And we're really interested in sustainability, and sort of our work has grown out of thinking about that. But we increasingly know that sustainability is really predicated very much on making social value and you know, sustaining communities so that they are you know, they can get by, they can feed themselves well, they're coherent, they're safe, and they're happy. And we've been you know, as part of our work over the course of the last sort of 5 years, we've been working over a number of projects with Ebbsfleet Development Corporation. And Ebbsfleet DC is a body which was set up by the government to stimulate development for a healthy new town. That means that it actually gets money from the NHS, but its principles are like a garden city. And we've done a number of projects there about civic infrastructure, working with communities and thinking about the design of a health and wellbeing hub, which is going to form part of a community offer at the heart of the new centre of the town. So I want to say a little bit about that because we're working with Bromley by Bow to do our really quite extensive engagement with all of the parties that have been involved in this project. So let me try and advance my slides. So yeah, so really my interest in this area has grown not just out of our, you know, interest in trying to make a better future for the planet and for everybody who lives in it, but actually, I'm sorry, I'm one ahead. Thinking about, you know, what is it about the built environment which contributes to our sense of place, sense of well-being, and our actual health. And I'm really struck by how much debate really there is about what kind of modern life and the way that we go about things, making the built environment as we are at the moment, contributes to that. So it might be, you know, loneliness and isolation, the problems of aging, the problems of growing up as a young person, our transport, our air, the quality of the air, the things we eat, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there are absolutely myriad issues connected with the built environment that we need to think about and need to adjust if what we're going to do is essentially make a world in which people are much more able to take care of their own health and be mutually supportive to each other at a kind of emotional level as well. So, I mean, there's lots of bad stuff, but we also are getting to know much more about what's the really good stuff. And one of it is about connecting with people, which has already been talked about. And some of it, a lot of it is actually about having agency and about getting out in nature, about breathing well, about being mobile, about being autonomous, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, tons and tons of issues connected with how to make a better built environment. And the built environment needs to really address this if what we're going to do in the future is you know, save ourselves and save the planet. And I think that the recent COVID outbreak has been a really interesting sort of wake-up call about that, you know, money and capitalism is not the be-all and end-all, that we really actually have other values and goals that we need to pay attention to if we're going to survive well. So I just want to talk a little bit about the context in Ebbsfleet. So this is a plan of London. Central London is to the left of the slide, and you can see the Thames estuary, and Ebbsfleet is where the big red dot is. So it's in North Kent. It's in the estuarine area of North Kent. It's not very far from Dartford and Gravesham, but it's actually a kind of in-between area between the riverine villages of things like Greenhithe and Dartford and Gravesend and so forth. But it's in the Garden of England, and it actually is right on the edge of an area of outstanding natural beauty, lots of farmland, the North Downs and so forth, and it's amazing. But traditionally, it has been an area where there's been a lot of industry. And a lot of that industry has been to do with gravel workings and extracting the lime in these chalk cliffs, which was exported by ship up to Norfolk to fertilize the ground there. But the ancient villages are very sweet, and you can see how they're cheek by jowl with a lot of industrial worlds there. But it's also the Garden of England, and actually what's really interesting about Ebbsfleet is the etching away of this landscape has created some incredibly dramatic places where you've got these white cliffs, and then you've got this massive shift in level between the top and the bottom with these galleries and things that go over it. So, you know, actually the opportunities for example, abseiling or rock climbing or the ecology of these funny spaces that are sort of left over is actually really amazing, and offer the most incredible opportunity, I think, for a very, very inspiring landscape at the heart of what we're doing. So one of the projects that we did for Ebbsfleet early on was think about how does the landscape actually contribute to giving the, what would you call the sort of visual clues to the kind of world that Ebbsfleet wants to be, which is this healthy garden city. And so we looked at all of the sort of themes that they're really interested in. So eating well, active every day, how culture contribute to that, how what people buy and the way they buy it can contribute to those kinds of things as well. And then the quality of buildings and the sustainability of buildings. So there's a lot to be celebrated there, but there are also a lot of challenges. Now, our project forms part of a raft of other buildings which are going to be the bedrock of the civic infrastructure, which is essentially to say all the community buildings which are going to be built around this area. At the moment, it's mainly housing because the new population is moving in, but we are going to be part of a much bigger facility which is going to go in this area. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, it's the black bit in the middle of the green patch, which is going to be central Ebbsfleet, and it's on the high-speed line to Paris. And it's also very near the A2, which is the old Watling Street, going straight from Dover into London. So it's extremely well connected. It's 15 minutes to St Pancras from there. So, you know, it's a very interesting and fast changing area. And the site for central Ebbsfleet is here. To the north is the international station, and you can see the lines going to the left. And our plot is looking south over the Ebbsfleet Valley, as part of a new master plan being developed by Allies and Morrison at the moment. So it's not without its issues. There's a lot of level changes and so forth, but it's really a very interesting site. Oop, I think I've gone too far. So we've done a lot of further engagement in this area, particularly with the community, to try and work out what it is that they feel is lacking in the area. And one of the things that we're really interested in doing is thinking about health through food and nutrition, because actually what's on offer there, although it's the north of Garden of England, is very, very poor nutritionally, and that's leading to all the classic health problems like strokes and heart disease and obesity and so forth. And it's doubled up by the fact that people find it hard to move, and so they go around by car a lot. And it would be very nice to try and promote self-mobile transport so that people keep fit in their daily routines. So I think keep skipping them. Yeah. So basically our project is trying to sort of tap into the opportunities offered by these wonderful landscape features like the cliffs, like the distant views that you can get across the very horizontal riverine landscape, tap into the woods and the fields and all of the other things that are on offer as sort of places to connect with nature. And use height as well as width in order to create a really interesting landscape in 3 dimensions within the building. And one of the things we're really interested in is this sort of grading between nature, which is sort of the bottom right hand, informal, kind of perhaps not very well, particularly heavily managed, through to something a little bit more managed, through to something quite formal landscape, and then into the building. And so in a way, the building itself becomes a landscape in its own right. And then it might end up with something much more formal in a marketplace, which is part of the city centre. So in a way, we're thinking of the building as merely a kind of indoor interruption within the landscape, but actually very much part of it, and celebrating the fact that it's a food culture there as much as anything else. And these are just some very, very early images of what that place could be like, to kind of drum up interest and get people to kind of start reacting to the sort of things that we're talking about. And so far, we're only a very short way through the journey, but I think you know, some of the ideas that are beginning to emerge are actually really, really fascinating and interesting. And so here, for example, you see part of that building, and you see the cliffs, and you see how they can be places of produce, or, you know, where a yoga class can take place, or where even up on the roof, you could have a consultation with a GP. So there's lots of ways in which, you know, health comes into the building, but without your really knowing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That's absolutely brilliant, and really kind of illustrates so many of the kind of, well, fantastic illustration of what's going on in Ebbsfleet, and this kind of real ambition around creating a new healthy, it's the first new garden city for 100 years, and what it therefore needs to really fulfill its ambition, but also to kind of get a lot of the points of principle that you are of kind of considerable interest to your practice as well, and your kind of thoughts about humanity, which I absolutely love, and what we need to do to kind of recalibrate things and so on. Absolutely fantastic. And last but by no means least, I'd like to invite you, Gordon, who after all was the architect behind the Bromley by Bow Centre as a physical entity, and also, I mean, really your interesting journey, of which I don't know it fully at all, but of course that started off, I think, with a small scale piece of work within the church itself, and some really interesting creative rethinking about the church space, and then of course developed out into both the health centre and the extension of the community centre that became Britain's first healthy living centre, and has been a model of thinking for many ever since. So Gordon, I'd like you to invite you to introduce yourself, please.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Good, okay. Yeah, a lot of what you talk about is like being a good life, I just call architecture, and I'm an architect, so it's a given. And if I didn't do it, I'd be a bad architect. And if people don't do it, they're bad architects, and you should sack them. So I don't really want to talk about what I think is given. I mean, I'm in a room, I just turned around so the sun shines on me, and out there is a big copper beech tree, looks across Dartmoor, and the sun's shining. You know, that's architecture. People try and make it more complicated, and I think it's an urban problem that people try and tie it up in knots. It isn't really very complicated. I think what worries me about the present situation in the health service is that, is it a health service? Is it a longevity service? Is it really about making people healthy, or is it really about just making them live longer, which is a very expensive trick to play on people if it makes them suffer, which I suspect it does. I think there was a lot of suffering in COVID that didn't need to happen because of bad medicine. And just to go back to the Bromley by Bow Centre, the thing that drove the design of the medical parts, or the health centre part of that, was the relationship between the physician and the patient. And I'd been trained by Jonathan Miller, you know, of Beyond the Fringe fame, and Jane Abercrombie. And the point that they were both trying to make is that as an architect, what you're trying to do when you create something like a health centre or an educational facility is to mediate the relationship between somebody who's got something that somebody else wants. In other words, the doctor has got medical knowledge that presumably the patient doesn't have. But in order for the doctor to diagnose the patient has to be relaxed. So a lot of the design is about trying to get people relaxed. Well, nature is a good way of getting people relaxed. So what concerns me about the health service as it's sort of redefining itself is it's almost going into the hospitality industry. And I don't like the hospitality industry. I've really enjoyed its demise over COVID. You know, I mean, I use it, but I don't want to be treated as a punter for the rest of my life. I like to engage in what seems to me to be worthwhile activities, and I still build things, and I own quite a lot of property. So I'm a landlord and I have tenants. But the vagueness with which we approach the problem of health suggests to me that we don't really know what we're talking about. And I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you, Gordon. I'm going to come back to you later on in the discussion, because I think there are a number of aspects of Bromley by Bow that I'd like to open up with you, but let's leave it there for now. We've got some questions coming in as well from, and do ask more questions via the chat. And as Berenice said earlier, we will take some of those questions and read them out, but also maybe invite some people to pose those questions themselves. Will, I'd like to come back to you, if I may, to start the conversation. And you've been involved in, as you say, a number of developments of healthy living centres and health initiatives within communities. And as you said, with sort of varying degrees of well, successful difference, I think, in terms of how those have developed. And obviously the levels of ambition of some of those projects have been quite different as well. But it'd be interesting to hear kind of some of the experience that you've had of how you've sought to work, as you say, with the wide range of partners around the thinking behind those healthy living centres, or those approaches to creating community health and well-being, and how you start to sort of, because everybody's coming from a different perspective often in terms of what they're thinking is needed and what they're thinking the functions might be, and the intentions really. And as you know, Gordon's just highlighted really, you know, there is a balance to be struck here between GPs who've got to go on doing some, you know, some quite traditional work that GPs do, alongside the need for spreading out that thinking beyond just a biomedical approach. And it'd be really interesting to hear some of your reflections on that experience, and both kind of some of the successes, but also some of the challenges that you faced.
Yeah, I think what was really resonating when Gordon was speaking there is that the the successful projects I've been part of and those that haven't, it really comes down to the being really clear from the outset, what's the purpose of the building and what is it you're actually setting out to achieve? Is it a health centre, or is it much more than that? Is it truly a much more integrated health and wellbeing hub? How you're really thinking about the experience that people want to go through when they get there, the culture, the different values that you want to, infuse into it. Is it truly a holistic experience, or is it actually much more about the medical thing? And there's no necessarily a right or wrong of that, but it's that clarity of what it is you're actually seeking to achieve that I think is so important, because like you're saying, everyone will come at it from a different starting point and a different perspective and a different set of assets or challenges or opportunities that they'll see from their thing. But what I think, certainly from my own perspective, ones that have been really successful is when each person can see what that shared vision is, what it is that it's actually trying to accomplish, and then understand their place within that and understand their starting point, going, actually, if I want to be in a place like that, I've got to move on a bit of a journey to get there, or this sounds like the perfect space for me because that is aligned with what I'm trying to achieve. And I think some of the examples are, which I can talk about, where I think you can start off with an initial vision that sounds great and all wonderful, but then if all the other partners who start to hear about it don't quite really understand what that purpose is, and there isn't that common shared purpose and understanding of what it's setting out to achieve, is the way you get quite a lot of disconnect. So if I give the example, this is my own experience of like the West Norwood Health and Leisure Centre in Lambeth, which by all accounts had this dream of the similar thing to Bromley by Bow, and very different dynamics, but similar ambitions to what was being described in Eppley, which was, let's take this important piece of land in the middle of West Norwood, in the heart of Lambeth, and let's bring together this wonderful intersection between health and well-being, and let's have GP surgeries, a dentist based there. We can have, it's right next door to a school. It's really closely located to a train station. It's right on next to the high street. We've got a leisure centre that we can incorporate. So there'll be physical activity and gym and a swimming pool. And let's bring it all together in one place. And I think that was the vision, but what wasn't really in my mind then captured by each of the partners that again got involved with it was, well, what is the real purpose of this, and how are we all going to work together when we get there? So I think what then ended up happening is that each of the components of that place, whether you're the leisure provider, the GP, the dentist, kind of didn't buy or really fully understand that shared the opportunity of working together, that experience that Gordon was describing, and ended up going, okay, that all sounds really great, but actually what's really important to me is that my GP surgery has X, Y, and Z. What's really important is that our gym facility has the following things. And so everyone then very quickly started to create their own needs within the space. And so and I think what it then lacks when you go in there, and you get a disjointed experience, because each of those partners didn't find a way to say, well, actually, if we're going to create this really different experience for someone, we've all got to actually really work together and change the way each of us do our individual thing within that space. But I think the point I would make, just to emphasize, is the importance of getting everyone really on the same page with whatever the purpose is and whatever the ambition and the values, that from the outset, because when there's differences in that, you end up all being physically in the same space, but you're not actually there with a sort of shared connection. And that's quite symptomatic of a lot of the challenges that we all experience in current working environments, and whether it's on your own street or you're, in your office place, where we all might be located in the same building or in the same team, but are we really challenging the way that we connect around each other and what it is that we're doing together?
Great, thank you, Will. That's really, interesting reflections, and it's kind of really interesting to distill out what some of the kind of lessons are that I think our collective experience probably has about this, and the challenges of how you get that kind of collective vision, and what it then means in terms of how people work together on this. Sarah, you're working, well, we're working on this live project, the Ebbsfleet Health and Wellbeing Hub. And it'd be interesting to kind of reflect on, you've talked a lot about the context and how that provides a huge opportunity and indeed sets the vision, I think, for this Health and Wellbeing Hub in terms of its geographical context. How do you feel about sort of the organizational context, as it were? How does the process of working with partners, or as Will's described, the people who will then have to make this thing work, as it were, and to what extent, is it? I mean, there are kind of real kind of constraints around commissioning and how things are commissioned and the processes that are implicit in that, and how one kind of tries to build in the right developmental processes around thinking and organizational connection that is needed to create the integration that a future building is going to want in order to function well.
Yes, I think it's something that we think about a lot and struggle a lot with because, as you'll know, Dan, I mean, there's a sort of spectrum of people that you're trying to gather in order to try and move the project forward and give it its character, its life, create its ethos and all the rest of it. And at one level, architects are quite used to working sort of from the top down, where, you're commissioned by somebody who wants something. But actually, in a way, I think it's, as Will has pointed out, its success really depends on it growing from the bottom up. So it's got to work at sort of both levels. And I think when you're dealing with any there's a sort of balance of power in it all as well, isn't there? Because, you've got atomized individuals, or what we call communities, sort of working away and with their own desires and their own capabilities and their own whatever. And then you've got kind of institutional structures, which tend to be the mechanisms by which buildings are brought forward. And I think those are often in tension, and they have different interests and different ways of operating, and even different conceptual models. One's very technicized, the other one's much more about emotion, about place, and time, very time dependent, because these things take a lot of time to emerge, to consolidate, to become an entity that's kind of recognizable, rather than a lot of disparate things that are sort of sloshing around and so forth. So I think all of those things need time to kind of what I'd call gestate somehow into something, to gel into something which is sort of a viable proposition. And I think we've already worked for 5 years in Ebbsfleet, beginning to get to know a little bit the cast of characters, but even that's very fluid. And certainly I think, procurement processes in the built environment tend not to recognize time as a sort of factor in all of this. And I think in a way that's what's really unique and very inspiring about Bromley by Bow, that it's kind of emerged over time, and it's been, owned by the people who are living there, who are running it, managing it, and it's kind of going with those fluxes, if that's the right word. I don't know what the plural of flux is, but anyway, whatever. And and it's kind of able to respond and adapt and develop and expand, contract, whatever, at this. As those things happen. I'm sure that's probably a bit rose tinted, because I know that, you have to fundraise and chase the money and all of the other pressures that everyone in the charitable and voluntary sector has to do. So it's certainly not free of those kinds of pressures. But, from the perspective of an outsider, I think it models itself in a slightly different way. And I think it's managed that balance extremely well. And as someone who's kind of coming at it from a more technocratic position, perhaps, of the architect bound up in the procurement systems, it's sort of difficult to manage that. It's a sort of, it's an existential issue.
Yeah. Great, Sarah, that's really, really helpful. And I'm going to invite Gordon, if you may, to talk a little bit then about the process at Bromley by Bow I mean, Gordon, you were living fairly nearby, I know, and had a kind of a relationship with Bromley by Bow that certainly predated the design of the health centre and then the community centre and then finally the eco barn in the park. I'm genuinely asking these questions about something I don't really fully know, which is kind of what that, you know, Sarah's described this idea of wanting to have an iterative journey of building relationship, getting to know the cast of characters and getting to know the ideas that they have as much as you have around the design and the intention, as Will said, understanding the intention of something. You know, you have created I think a quite, I mean, I take people around Bromley by Bow pretty much every week and have shown, you may not know this, Gordon, about 10,000 people I've shown around Bromley by Bow in the last 8 years, talking about Bromley by Bow, its design and its function and the model. And universally, people respond to it in an incredible way, actually. The response to the physical conjunction and the design, which I think is characterful but not imposing, I describe it as. It's a building full of character, but nonetheless does not impose upon those who are within it, and it allows people to very much be themselves, I always feel. You know, you might have a group of older Bangladeshi women in our walking group meeting in the cafe before they go off for their walk, or some East End hipsters with their laptops in the cafe or sitting in the park on a sunny day, or the kids who stream out of the primary school over the road and find their way to the children's playground, or people going in to see the doctors or learning English or whatever it happens to be at Bromley by Bow. And, you know, it treats very acute need. We have a food bank there now. We have lots of welfare advice. We have general practice. But we also have choirs and people learning how to do stained glass and people just enjoying a cup of coffee in the cafe and some sun as the sun streams through those sort of ceiling to floor glass windows from the cafe that look out over the beautiful 3-acre park that you helped to design and landscape and so on. The response to Bromley by Bow, I think, without exception of those 10,000 people I've shown around, has been immensely positive and absolutely resonates with the architecture. And it'd be really interesting to hear the process by which you worked with the team at Bromley by Bow to develop the buildings and how you responded as an architect to the brief, I guess a formal brief, but also maybe the kind of informal brief that you were getting from people about what they wanted.
It's probably not quite the story you'd expect. I mean, two people were important. First of all, Lord Andrew Mawson, because he had a church that wasn't very busy and he wanted to make it more busy. And he decided, because health was so poor in this particular part of Tower Hamlets, that maybe the government would like to intervene and provide a health centre. An officer from the Government Office for London, Daniel Oppenheimer, worked briefly, well, maybe 3 years at the centre, and he pretty much managed the finances, which I didn't have to manage. I had to keep the building on budget, obviously, and it was about £2.5 million. By modern standards, it's very cheap building. But it was actually designed as a generic health centre for 2 practices, because Andrew Mawson had difficulties finding doctors to come in with him who were one might say professional. One of them actually got struck off for female genital mutilation. So there was a succession of doctors who were looked at as potential occupiers of the health centre. And then Sir Sam Everington came along with his practice, and that solved the problem. And then it wasn't for 2 practices, it was just for his practice. And he's a very good doctor. I mean, that's a very important thing to have in a health centre, is a good doctor. Bad doctors in good health centres, rubbish. You know, first thing you need in a health centre is a good doctor. And there are plenty of rubbish doctors. I've met a few in my life. And that's one of my concerns, really, is that if the medicine's bad, everything's bad. So the medicine has to be good if you're talking about health, it seems to me. The way I designed a generic health centre, possibly for 2 practices, was to look at NHS guidance on the design of health centres. but I made one inversion, and that is I put the people inside in a courtyard and let them fan out to the doctors on the outside against a park. Could have gone disastrously wrong because of all the people in the park could have made the people in the consulting rooms think that they were being spied upon. I managed to achieve a disconnection there with a dike and a curved building. But that's the one big invention really, is that inversion, to put the doctors on the outside around a hub, if you like, and the people on the inside in a courtyard, which allowed a degree of privacy for people who are coming to talk to a doctor about something that they might find embarrassing, and certainly something they don't want everybody else to know about. So on that basis, you know, that's how we got the health centre. The rest of the buildings, they're put together in a fairly ramshackle way and just made reusable by small alterations. From a sustainability point of view, that's a lot better than knocking them down and starting again, because the embodied energy in things like this brick wall, and that's a stone wall actually, and this lime plaster is very considerable. And if you throw it all away and do it all again, you're probably wasting energy and making the world a worse place. So I don't think there's anything else to say really. It happened to work. It happened to work probably because it was flexible enough for the people who came along, like yourself, to get what they needed out of it in terms of vessels for social activities. I don't personally think that the kind of vessel that works for a social activity is very mysterious. If you're in the hospitality industry and you get it wrong, you close, you know? If you want people to be happy in a space and you don't know how to do it, you're going to close. So people vote with their feet. And I'm not myself a great enthusiast of the bottom-up thing. The idea that if everybody gets together and says, this is what we'd like, can't we have this and can't we have that? You can't question the design. Because what will question the design is whether it is useful or not, whether people want to go there. And similarly with the planning system, I like the planning system. It allows people to comment on other people's NIMBY projects and very often kill them because they don't like what other people want to do next door. But then there's an appeal system, which is a little bit more rational. But as an architect, I think it's better to put out there what it is you can offer in a form that people can understand. And if they don't like it, retire. You know, don't say, oh, that's all right, I'll just listen to what you want. And then when you've told me what you want and I've designed it, you can't have anything else because it's bottom up now. It's not my idea, it's your idea. It's a bit like a doctor saying, well, you know, I don't know anything about medicine, you know, so you tell me, what would you like? More smack? You know, would that make it feel, oh no, that's bad for you, isn't it? So you can't have the patient telling the doctor how to use medicine. And I don't think you can design from the bottom up. You can design and people will decide if they like it and use it. I mean, I think I'm quite good at designing things that people like. I could take you to a farm I own in Cornwall and you'd probably think it's just like the Bromley by Bow Centre, except it doesn't have any medicine going on in it. Anyway, that's enough, really.
Thank you, Gordon. And I think you've raised a really interesting sort of set of points here around roles and how you really work with people's areas of specialism, areas of knowledge, and completely get the point about, you know, the role of the architect around interpreting, understanding the activities that people want to take place in a particular place, and the set of relationships between those activities, and then designing for those. Of course, absolutely, completely understand that. I think what's really interesting is that you designed, as you say, a health centre without at the time knowing who the medical teams were who would be inhabiting that set of buildings. And you designed, certainly in the design of some of the aspects of the health centre, a very unconventional health centre, based on the principles that you described, and you know, use of materials, use of relationship between spaces, and so on and so forth. A very open reception area in the health centre, and so on. which in a sense the medical team who were then going to come into Bromley by Bow were faced with, if you like, a fait accompli in terms of what the design was. I think also the point that you make about the flexibility of Bromley by Bow, it's sort of almost, its infinite adaptability to change has also been definitely, as you say, one of the hallmarks, and I completely concur with your thinking. We certainly don't want to be knocking down and rebuilding buildings every 20 years, which I guess is also part of the challenge of designing health and wellbeing facilities for the future, is how do you anticipate sort of social trends and trends of services, not just for the lifetime of between now and a building being built and opened, but also, for the next 30 or 40 or 50 years. And there's a huge amount of debate around how services will be delivered in our communities within that lifespan. I just thought it'd be interesting, Berenice, we've got a couple of questions from groups within the audience, and it would be great to maybe hear somebody either read out or invite somebody to contribute one of their questions.
Yeah, that sounds great. Actually, I might just kind of bundle a couple of questions together related to what was just said. We had a question about how do we get NHS GPs and GPs on board with this model, kind of in the beginning of building those kind of projects. And then another question which is related to this and what we were just saying is about what kind of partners need to be kind of approached to and be on board to deliver the kind of program of work at the wellbeing centers. So those were questions for Sarah, but also generally for everyone on the panel.
Yeah, great. Sarah, would you like to, because you've been obviously working closely with some GPs and a wide range of partners around the development of the Ebbsfleet Health and Wellbeing Hub, and what your experience of that's been.
Sure. I mean, I think, there's no such thing as a perfect engagement, but I think there have to be sort of co-creation, if you like, through sort of as much discussion by the design team with the people who are likely to have a stake in the building as possible. I mean, obviously you're going to run out of fees, you're going to run out of time, and people move on, and some are not interested, and all the rest of it. But I mean, even within a flawed process, I think you need to do what you can. And in a way, I guess I wanted to say something in response to what Gordon said, because actually I personally think that the engagement with the users is in a way more interesting and important than engagement with the clients. Obviously you need the clients because they're the people commissioning stuff and they've got the money normally, although not always. But at the same time, I've found that working with the people who, know what they want to do, trying to provide services, understand their own clients, like for example in a school, and it's the kids and so forth, and are trying to forge an ethos for what they do. It really gives you the clues to how to sort of unlock the potential of the building. And in a way, I mean, it sounds a bit corny, but I suppose there's a sort of bit of DIY psychology going on in the background where you're trying to work out what are people's real interests and motivations for getting on board with this project. And are they, and how do you tap into that in order to give it a bit of momentum and to have a conversation with them about what is going to do it for them? And I mean, sometimes they don't even know that. And I think that's where the designer skills do kick in, because I think that's, you're proposing ideas which can shunt their thinking forward or backwards in whatever ways, they move them in some direction and can get them to see, new insights, for example, about how you might combine uses which classically are separated, and where we know that actually could have a benefit. For example, you might present to your GP because you're depressed or you are not sleeping, and you find that actually probing a little bit, one of the problems that this person is experiencing is they've got some financial worries. and they might be in debt or something like that. So that's not typically a medical problem, but it manifests as a medical problem. And actually, you've got to get underneath that. So it might involve the GP, and there might be a temporary solution, which might involve something that's medicalized. But at the same time, there's a bigger thing underneath all of that, which also needs to get solved. And you need to work collaboratively in order to do it. And, you know, and all the child abuse issues that we've had recently in the news, you know, they're all to do with not joining up the thinking between different agencies. And so bringing these people together, I think, is absolutely classically important. And you know, trying to work with people in the round so that, you know, they're all in the room together and they're appreciating that there's a different language and a different meaning to the things they say. And, you know, every discipline has its own way of thinking and so forth. And actually it's a good thing to challenge that. And I think, you know, Gordon described designing the GP surgery at Bromley by Bow by using the NHS manual. And I think, you know, all these manuals, they inscribe a way of thinking about design. And it typically, because we're coming out of a modernist era, you know, it's all about functionality. And what it's doing is it's sort of stripping the ways people behave or act into certain strands and separating them. And I think, you know, we're coming out of that era now and beginning to think, actually, maybe we need to join these things up again. But obviously, the spatial results of that thinking do inscribe ways of behaving subsequently. And that's, you know, one of the things that we kind of fight against and try and adjust really in the discussions with people, you know, bringing them on, you know, to think about the world in a different way and how what they're trying to produce could be done more effectively through the way that space is planned.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. So maybe now's a good moment, because we know that NHS guidance essentially tells you that, you know, you've got a registered patient population of 10,000 people. So you need, you know, X number of, you know, small consulting rooms, and you need whatever it's called, a dirty store and a clean store and a whatever. And it just absolutely sets this out in some sort of ratio of patients to space. And yet I know we've been having discussions about, you know, if you read the GP press, there are, well, wildly varying, but nonetheless, you know, estimates of teleconsultations may be anywhere between 25 and 50% of all general practice consultations in the future. We've no idea, of course, but the answer is it's going to be many, many more than it was prior to COVID, even in a post-COVID world, if ever we get there. We know that the rise of long-term health conditions, I don't know if people know this, but about 50% of consultations in general practice are for people with long-term health conditions who only probably form about 20% or less of the patient list. And then there's a lot of thinking about, well, actually, would they benefit from group sessions rather than entirely individual sessions? Obviously a mix of both. And so there's this sort of thinking about the health system going forwards and what it's going to look like in 10, 15, 20 years and beyond. And then we have an NHS manual that stipulates really a manual probably that was written 10 years ago already, or whenever it was last revised, I have no idea, and is rooted in a practice that is currently out of date and can only become more out of date, really. And how does one work with that, Sarah?
Well, I think our job is partly to try and challenge it, but I mean, we're challenging very ingrained behaviors and, you know, models of sort of understanding space, largely come about through economics, perhaps, and, you know, custom and practice and so forth. But I think I mean, and it is quite difficult to predict how changes in spatial organization, which also means the way that people interact with each other, and you know, what the results will be without actually trying it out in reality. So at one level, I think there has to be a bit of a mentality to take some risks and see what the results are if we do that. And there are examples around the world where people have taken that risk and done it. And perhaps we could really learn from that and be emboldened to do it. I suppose one of the issues is, where it's public money, people feel very reluctant to take those kinds of risks. But in a way, I think there are also lots of risks by not doing these things. And those are often risks that are not weighed up. And I think it's really obvious that where, even if we think economically, where you can do things which could save money long way down the line, it really might be worth doing that, because if we carry on the way we are, the dysfunctionality will probably grow. So I think, there's a lot of issues in here, and I think it's partly changing hearts and minds, and finding the people around you who are, up for, I guess, disrupting the current model, and trying to build examples where people feel they can be emboldened to take that risk.
That's fantastic. You've just sparked a set of thoughts in my mind, actually. Yes, and about risk taking, and about what are the costs of failure, or just doing something that doesn't work and reiterating it in a kind of very, very minorly modified way. And you also reminded me of, so maybe we need some exemplars of things that we are very experimental, that we know may fail, but that's the whole point of them. I'm sure all these people like Steve Jobs or whatever, say that, our greatest successes are our mistakes or something like that.
Absolutely.
You just also reminded me, of course, of the Peckham experiment, which was called the Peckham experiment. This idea, and Bromley by Bow is often talked about as a latter-day version of the Peckham experiment, but actually the clue was in its name. It was an experiment, and like all experiments, you don't know what the result's going to be. That's the whole purpose of an experiment.
Exactly.
But if we don't create a series of experiments, and Ebbsfleet or others don't have to be the only ones, we need a series of these things to then learn from, and learn what works and what doesn't necessarily work. And that's the whole point, surely. But if you think about the scale of the UK in terms of health premises, a few experiments are insignificant in terms of the amount that they would cost, in terms of the amount of gain that they would produce, presumably.
Absolutely. And I think, sometimes in the building world, people don't want to invest in a greater capital cost, because actually the benefits accrue to a different model, a different category in the treasury or something. Like you can build, you pay more for the building, but actually your health costs are less. And I think that's an equation that we also haven't got our head around either. It's that sort of, it's what I was saying, sort of, functionally stranding out different parts of life in order to kind of create a cost model, but actually by thinking about it as a much more expanded field where these things are cross-cutting, actually there are benefits if only you can recognize it.
Yeah, great, fantastic. That's going to hang on to that. Will, can we come to you now? And how does this resonate with your experience of, you've worked on multiple projects in terms of getting people to think beyond their kind of conventional thinking, and as Sarah's just said, expand out what the understanding of who's got something to gain from this, and the costs, where costs go in, they're not necessarily where the savings accrue, but there's a savings of the whole system, and hopefully, of course, better lives as well. So it'd be great to hear you on your experience of trying to help generate that thinking.
Yeah, it's been really interesting because there's so many issues that we've been raising, and that's part of why this is so challenging. It's very complex. So, but it comes to something that Gordon said earlier, that actually architecture is simple, and actually I think all of this is getting very simple with this, rather than thinking, oh, what about this? What about that? It's got to meet this regulation. It's got to X, Y. You can get so bogged into the detail that you lose sight of the kind of simplicity of it, which is, how do we all come together? What is our vision that we're trying to create? And if we're really clear on the purpose of our, or I suppose of the culture and the values and the way we want to operate in a space, that's what the simplicity of it is, just focus on that. So, and I guess if I was to just describe the system at the moment we have is very risk orientated. It's very rigid. It's got really set guidelines. There's a fail safe environment. We can't, afford to take those risks. We have to get it right. We can't. It's very reductionist. It's very much everyone thinking about their very specific thing. It's very detailed. It's very financially driven, and there's a lot of thought about the kind of material short-term impact of things and what things look like. It's very transactional on the surface, and I think that the challenge is that the vision of what we're describing, or what I was talking about earlier about the ethos of Bromley by Bow. The what makes Bromley by Bow successful, what makes the good doctor that Gordon was referring to, or the willing partner, is that there will be a certain set of attributes and a way in which those people are doing things where the thinking is much more about experiment, safe to fail, rather than creating fail safe. It's a more flexible environment. I think that everyone's sort of been indicating, or Gordon was describing it, that Bromley by Bow didn't have exactly the set manual. It's kind of evolved over time, and that's quite challenging where a system tells you it needs to be very structured and rigid. And also that if you're thinking about being very holistic, how do you incorporate all of that into all of your decisions? And a great doctor, if you go back to what for me is what a really good doctor is not a great prescriber of medicine. It's not that. It's that when it's needed. But actually the good doctor, a bit like the good architect, it's thinking about the holistic bit, the interaction of it, keeping it simple, thinking about how you can play to the strengths of the area. What is it that we can do to empower those that use the site or the patient in front of me to make the most of these things? How is it that we can think both short term and long term, not just thinking about the financial elements of it, not just thinking about the health elements of it, but that much wider social determinants or community interest? And I guess I'll keep going back to it, I suppose, is in approaching any of your health and wellbeing hubs in any part of the country or whatever it is that you've got in your area. For me, it's about how you approach it is so key, and how you bring people around you, whether they're the doctor, the architect, the local person, the whoever else is interested in this, in and around the same way of working. And if they're really bought into that vision, and you've got to then challenge yourselves really hard to work in this way and not get sucked into being really rigid and fail safe and just driven by the finances. And I actually really agree with what Gordon said. It's not about bottom up. It's about working collectively, working collaboratively as a whole community. It's then really challenging not to be driven by one agenda. So how do you do it in such a way that everyone has a voice and everyone understands that if you're going to be in a health and wellbeing hub, it's going to be fun. It's going to be a generous space where we all contribute to it, where it's not more important to be bottom up than top down. It's not more important to be the professional than the patient, and vice versa. It's that lovely mix of all of those things, all brought together but the key to it is how you go about it, and being, for me, and that's why I think Bromley by Bow was so interesting for me when I went down and I saw how it was being done, not what was happening in front of me, but the how behind it, and that's quite hard for people quite conceptually to get. There was one question in the chat that I found really interesting. I think it was Amina, I think in Lewisham, was talking about how important a space looks, and she was describing, I think, a waiting room and how you make a space dull, and whether it's the looks that make it important. For me, coming back to the point of just making it, it's about how you bring a space alive. And sometimes physically, yeah, you can design it and make it beautiful, and that's one way of making it alive. But I've been into many very, very inspiring, visually very beautiful buildings, but you don't have no connection to it because it feels like a dead space, because what you also need behind the visually space is the ethos of fun and creativity. It's a warm welcome. And, I've seen a few people on here who work in like arts organizations or in different community things. And you can go into a building that looks like a shed and it doesn't look very appealing on the outside. But when you go in there, you get that wonderful sense of warmth and connectivity and community. And that everyone there is singing from the same page, that you can interact with the space in whatever way you want. And the perfect space has the right balance between all of those things. It's like, so how do you make what you've got in front of you look as great as you can? And that's the combination of physical things that you can do, but it's also about how you can bring it alive, I think, by looking at these kind of sets of values and behaviors.
Thank you, Will. And a couple of reflections on what you've just said. And you wrote that wonderful piece that's in the King's Fund report on NHS facilities and social prescribing that Ben Collins put together. And you said that people come to Bromley by Bow and think it's all about the cobblestones or something, and it's not. It's about the kind of human infrastructure that's there. Of course, it is about both, but I think you're completely right. It's not about having a nice water feature and a courtyard and some cobbles. The design is important, but it's a backdrop to the human activity that takes place. And there within is the curation, I think, of the model, the absolute attention to working on the ongoing development of a model, and it never goes away. I mean, it's a continual process of reflection and curation of what is this human set of interactions that we're trying to establish here and how they work, which is absolutely critical. There is one thing, though, that I think is a feature of Bromley by Bow, and I completely get the point, by the way, that we can all go to these amazing health centres that've got quadruple height atriums and these vast cathedral-like spaces with often very, very high-spec furniture, and they look absolutely impeccable. It's a bit like walking into a bank or something, actually, in terms of their grandeur, but they are also huge and really quite the level of scale is quite intimidating, and humans don't seem to find any connection to the space at all, actually, even though they are lavishly done and obviously incredibly well appointed, and done with considerable panache and style, it has to be said, but nonetheless actually have kind of in a different way lost the human touch. But I guess one of the hallmarks of Gordon, of your design, was use of natural materials, lots of glass so people can see through from one space to another, this concept of desire lines, of allowing people to know where they're getting to before they get there and enticing them along that journey. And I think almost no two rooms are the same at Bromley by Bow, which is wonderful. And they don't have an institutional feel to them. And that includes the furnishings as well. And I think having people, particularly social activities, if people are going to do social activities, it absolutely kills them if they do it in a bland, nondescript space full of plastic chairs and plastic tables or something. I think you do want something that speaks a bit to the domestic and a bit to a sort of notion of quality around the furnishings and the environment. I was going to, there was a question asked, which I think I might be well placed to respond to. So I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to hand over and ask a hard-nosed question, which is, how do we stack this up financially? Because people are asking that in the chat. So I'm going to ask you about that in next. But people have said, how do we build health centres to encompass the new roles coming into primary care? And we know that there's a whole shed load of new roles coming into primary care networks, social prescribing link workers, obviously, but health and wellbeing coaches, pharmacists, care coordinators, a whole lot of people who are very closely attached to the clinical world, but actually their function with patients is not getting them to lie on a couch and doing an examination and that sort of thing. You don't need little consulting rooms to do much of this work. And I think that poses a significant, there was an article in GP Online, which is one of the GP trade magazines, talking that was actually written by somebody who's about to publish a report for the King's Fund at the end of this month, absolutely talking about the fact that primary care estate is going to need to look very different to not just accommodate these roles, but accommodate how these roles function. that's in the sort of patient or facing aspect of their functions. And this idea that we might be doing a lot more group sessions, say, with patients with long-term health conditions. At the other end, the back end, actually, there's something really interesting that they hit upon in South Central Alaska in the NUCA system, which is that clinicians don't do their paperwork and follow-up work in their consulting rooms. They do it in small open plan offices with their multidisciplinary team. So having seen a patient in the consulting room, they go into their office, which is a far more appropriate environment, of course, and they do the follow-up paperwork or whatever they need to do, but it's an opportunity to share a few comments with their team members because they cluster the desks of their multidisciplinary team closely together. They had a metric, which was if professionals sit more than 15 feet apart, even in the same room, they really don't communicate very well. So you cluster these little multidisciplinary teams. And primary care is moving to the mode of multidisciplinary teams. But the estate is going to need to change too, because currently, a GP goes into their consulting room at 8 o'clock in the morning. They're probably lucky if they come out at 8 o'clock in the evening, because after they've seen the last patient, there's an enormous stack of paperwork to do, and so on. And it's all done in these very, very small consulting rooms, where the opportunity for kind of serendipitous, casual conversation with your peers, your multidisciplinary team is completely destroyed by the fact that you're in this little room on your own. And it's very isolating for clinicians in terms of their practice as well. But that's going to need a real rethink about both the public-facing spaces, the client-patient-facing spaces, and the back office spaces within general practice, for which general practice is really not equipped at the moment. So that's my response to that question. But in terms of the money, coming back to the money, because we can't shy away from the fact that one of the challenges of all of these integrated projects is putting the money together and how we get that to happen imaginatively so we don't end up with the tail wagging the dog, which is the money ends up determining the model. Will, and I know you've had quite a lot of kind of frustration around this in the past, but any glimmers of hope from you about how one might be able to do this?
Yeah, it's a really big gap. I mean, it links a lot, I think, to when one agenda, I think, ends up dominating what ending up being in the space. And I think, if we can have on paper a wonderful shared vision of an equal space that's very holistic, that taps into all these wonderful assets in the community. But ultimately, if the funder of it or a major funder of it goes, well, I'm only going to put my income into that if I get the following, and it becomes a very the ambition of the space becomes too heavily dominated by one agenda, then you will end up in and this is, I guess, a really big challenge for all of these different types of hubs, is how you can really embrace, if you're thinking about being holistic, being creative, being very flexible, being not just thinking about the financial return or the social return. You have to build those values into your financial decision making, into how you run the space, into how things are funded. So how are we going to fund something in a collective manner? How are we all going to contribute our assets, our financial contribution into something that's bigger than what I need to achieve on my own? And very, very difficult to do, because certain funding comes with really significant constraints. And but I guess where I've seen success, and where certainly on smaller scale this becomes easier to achieve, but I guess where Bromley by Bow, I think, has been successful from what I understand as well, is that you have a multitude of funders. You have a wide, and this is good practice for all sorts of things. I try to practice as much as I can in my own independent business, which is I have several different projects that I work on. Not all your eggs in one basket, that you aren't reliant or dependent on a person to fund you for all your work, that you have multiple different things that you can draw down at different times. So having a wide range of income streams, and therefore, which is actually the ambition of the site in my mind, which is to create spaces where multiple things happen at the same time. So playing to that ambition of a health and wellbeing hub where loads of things are going on, how is it that we can all find ways to fund this and to get income from many different sources it is the key. And what you might find is that you know, wherever you start with a hub, you could start with a community hub, and actually the council might put that in, or a charity might own a space and a venue and put something forward. You might have income coming in from these different roles. The thought of a social prescriber, the way in which you could bring in all these other NHS income sources into a space becomes quite interesting. How is it that you could look at the shared spaces and go, well, you know what, there's a lot of flexibility here. We don't all need to have 6 receptions when we come in here. So financially, if we just had one really interesting reception, we all contributed to that, you know, but also within that reciprocity, understanding that there are certain things that each person has to get out of it, so that you don't just impose you know, that everything goes into the shared pot. So I think where I found it's been successful is when the funders behind it have found a way to diversify their own or distribute their own control and agenda over it, where you have multiple funders. So you might have a bit of, you know, housing development or developer private development funding mixed in with NHS funding, mixed in with council funding, also funded by different departments within the council. So it could be a health and leisure budget alongside the actual public health streams, and having different ones coming in from different parts of the council. It could be a culture budget. We're talking about arts and health, and I know a number of people on the call have mentioned those sorts of things. So actually how you involve multiple different stakeholders in this. If you're working in a local area where there's a business improvement district or a school, or, you know, and again, you could have different sources of income. The big challenge with all of that, though, is about coming back to joining it all up. So from the beginning, having lots of different people from, you know, all around the you know, from the outset, thinking, you know what, actually, this is exciting to create a new model from the beginning, rather than setting it up under one person's guise and then trying to work back from that.
Great, thank you, Will. I've just been reminded by Berenice of the time, and this hour and a half's gone so quickly, and there's plenty more we could be discussing, I know. I'm going to kind of come around for a quick set of sort of closing comments from everybody, and Sarah, maybe you could incorporate any thoughts about stacking the finances of this up together. And I'd be really interested in your reflections, as you do as well, Gordon, about, you mentioned about the finances too from Bromley by Bow, and where was Bromley by Bow created in a less complicated time and a more benign environment? I don't know. But first of all, let's actually, let's go to you, Gordon, first, yes, and then we'll come to Sarah. Sorry, beg your pardon, in terms of order. You know, Gordon, what are your reflections on what made Bromley by Bow possible at that time in terms of finances, and any last comments from you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there was still, even in '97, a kind of hangover from the nanny state, an idea that the state could sort things out. In architecture too, it was a time when architects didn't feel very confident, and community architecture came along. What subsequently happened in architecture was narrative architecture, where architects, like politicians, discovered that if they just told people stories and people liked the stories, then they'd get lots of work. So the current thing, and it's not really died out yet, is narrative architecture. So you just talk and you tell everybody what they want to hear, and then they say, isn't that lovely? And then you get loads of money and you do what you like. So in that sense, because it was constrained, because a health centre had to have so many consulting rooms, and it had to have a certain relationship between the waiting room, the receptionist. The receptionist has the toughest job, by the way, in any health centre, much tougher than the doctors, because they're responsible for health and safety more than anybody else. That kind of thing. Yeah, it was simpler, but I think the fundamental problem is that the health service doesn't know what it's trying to do. And I don't like using it because it doesn't know really what it's up to anymore. I had an eye operation recently, and a surgeon held my head while I was conscious and made a slit in my eye, and then, you know, and I could feel his pressure on my head. I want that intensity from doctors in consulting rooms when they examine my body, but they don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to touch people. You know, they've lost the plot. They want to tell them stories. And as long as we just, I mean, this doesn't happen for my doctor daughter in A&E. She has to concentrate for a 12-hour shift without sitting down. She can't be casual. She can't go into a room to write up her notes and have a casual chat with somebody else. She has got to be on it. And this is what's worrying me, that nobody's on it. Everybody's just telling a story. Anyway, I mean, I'm being very provocative, but I'm really worried that's what's happening. And it's politicians who drive this, of course. It's not medical professionals.
No, and we need to listen to the practitioners. I'm going to, just in the interest of time, thank you, Gordon. And yeah, absolutely, it needs to be rooted with practitioners. Sarah, let's hear some just closing comments from you, and anything about how we put this together financially. Yeah.
Well, of course, I absolutely don't know how to do it. And I guess what Will said is pertinent, because I think there are power imbalances with where money comes from. And I think the NHS is a very centrally controlled operation at the moment. And actually, perhaps, I mean, at a really pragmatic level, it needs to release some of its funding to communities to begin to, you know, right down to the GP level or below that even, where the community sits, so that they have more agency to command the kind of health system that they might want, because clearly it's very tough. And I think it's getting very tough for GPs. I mean, we know that they're being harassed much more, it's more violent and so forth, and people are venting their anger on them. And so something's not working from the, what you might call the, you know, customer end. But I mean, I'm also really interested in how thinking about the built environment could help unlock this as well. I mean, I came across a firm of architects the other day who are looking at how to convert redundant shopping malls in the center of the high street, or even shops in the high street itself, because they're all, you know, a lot of them are empty at the moment. We don't know what to do with the high street, but actually to bring back, you know, activities that people want to do and offer services in those places with GPs in there. It's a rich mix, and it could be like, you know, like a kind of department store, if you like, that you're going to as a destination, because it's really fantastic and it's right in the center of town. And that could be developed with a bit of imagination and a bit of funding, and with the formula that Will's created. So, you know, I think it's sort of coming at it from both ends. There are opportunities everywhere, if only we could you know, find the formula to unlock it.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. And I'll catch up with you about something around shopping centres afterwards then, because it is being thought about, definitely. Will, let's come to you for last closing comments in the last minutes of this webinar.
Yeah, I think all I say is that webinars like this and the energy and enthusiasm from the list of people who've been asking questions and who've been on this call, I think that is for me what we should be focusing on, that there's a lot of fantastic energy and skill set and experience and interest, and the more that we realize that you're not alone in approaching these things, that there's lots of others that have been there and done it and had a go and are doing it right now. All I would say is that, yeah, keep believing in this, keep the energy up. I love hearing from everyone's different experiences, and that's part of that same ethos, which is, you know, we are part of that extended health and wellbeing hub at Bromley by Boat. And people mentioned in the chat some about the digital elements of it and the connectivity. I think it's you know, I think that is what I would keep focusing on. Keep coming to these things, keep finding ways to connect with others.
Great, thank you, Will. And we're coming out of time now, but just to say, and just to echo your comments, Will, and you know, 10,000 people have come to Bromley by Bow to learn about Bromley by Bow in the last 8 years. We are part of an enormous movement, and not just from the UK, by the way. We had the Minister for Health from Singapore and the Minister for Public Health from Thailand a couple of years back. You know, we are part of this kind of growing movement of people who've realized that we need to think differently, and we need to, as you say, keep connecting with each other to draw strength from each other and to learn from each other and keep supporting each other. We will look through the chat and see what we might be discussing in a future conversation as well about about this idea of health and wellbeing hubs and models, so that we can bring everybody back together again in the next few months to respond to some of the questions and some of the themes that people have raised today. And we keep this conversation going, and we keep talking and developing the ideas and supporting each other. So thank you all for being with us today. Thank you enormously to the panel. Thank you, Berenice, for putting this all together. And keep in contact, write to us, sign up for our newsletter. And if we can support in any way, of course, Will and Sarah and Gordon and myself and others are here to help everybody to move this forwards as well. So please do keep in contact, and hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Dan, for hosting. Like we said at the beginning, the recording will be sent to everyone next week. So yeah, hopefully keep in touch, and have a lovely rest of your day, everyone.
Great, thank you.